Wow, Gugu, thank you so much for that introduction. Good morning, everybody, from wherever you're joining us in the world. I'm going to take you on a journey, and it's a journey of storytelling and relevance, and I'd like you to come along with me. This might be challenging to make sense of, but the idea of PR as spin is dead, and no one should try to resuscitate it. If you're old enough and if you'll remember, there used to be a time when the rhetoric, if it bleeds, it leads, used to be a self-reinforcing statement in the press release to news coverage sausage factory. As a child, growing up in Attridgeville in Pretoria, my grandmother's house was full of loving embrace as much as it did strictness. This was typical of matriarchs of her generation tasked with raising grandchildren in the township. It was in this environment and era that my nose for news-making events got sharpened. From the shock value of political violence slapped on first pages of local newspapers of the time, to the inception of CNN in South Africa, circa the early 90s, as the O.J. Simpson court case was broadcast for us to see. And the emergence of the black elite, destined to put South Africa on the global map of high finance. All these bleeding and leading through a top-down approach of how the public relations and the news paradigm functioned. Baked into that, the lifeblood of how corporations peddled their brand stories through PR agencies for a little bit of shine in the news machinery, often unopposed and sterile. All of it expected to be received without any consequential feedback. I mean, you've got to admit, those were really wild times. But as we all know, the corporate brand story is no longer gospel. Brand stories are evolving. At the core of public relations is agenda setting. However, we are in an era of high social conflict, which often plays out as digitally clashing political ideologies through audience engagement. And this is what's forcing organizations to examine their core values and how they tell their stories. And within that examination is a fundamental realization that the organization no longer holds outright autonomy in agenda setting. The organization is only a participant in the so-called metaverse of voices where public relations has ceased to be a band-aid when reputational crisis emerges. Now, in the South African context, it would be remiss of us not to learn from the ongoing #StopShell campaign in the Wild Coast, where there is public outrage against Shell's efforts to explore gas in the area. Reasons for the outrage is that the survey has not considered the impact on the environment, but I think what's more personal is that the spiritual and the cultural practices of the population in the area, in the region, have also not been considered. This becomes yet another case of the people versus big corp, out of several others in recent years where the accused stands to be on the losing side of the reputational sliding scale. The textbook response to that, PR as a band-aid, would be get ahead of it, control the narrative. But in reality, can we though? As I've mentioned, the role of brands and stories and the role of PR is evolving. In our world as media practitioners, there's still a very widely held view of PR as being something that where you control the narrative. But that approach has diminishing returns and can be self-defeating to try and pretend that we are still rolling in the pre-social media era. As we've observed in many parts of the world, the control the narrative approach is only viable if you are fine with playing a zero-sum game that causes a fair bit of social destruction. And Donald Trump's presidential campaign comes to mind. And here in South Africa, a classic case of what is termed PR laundering by the now defunct UK reputation agency, Bell Pottinger, hijacked a legitimate debate about economic inequality on behalf of mercenary aims of a shadow government that was led by the Gupta-owned firm Oak Bay. With the help of Bell Pottinger, Oak Bay poisoned political discourse in South Africa through Twitter bots, through blogs, and infiltrating the news machinery under a campaign that highlighted economic inequality in South Africa. The goal was obviously to persuade South Africans of color that they were far poorer than they should be, mainly because of large white-owned corporations that had outsized power. And the subtext was a campaign that would not only be beneficial to the country, but would also bolster the brothers' financial position by casting them not as overstepping, right? But as outsiders countering white supremacy. And of course, there would be social destruction. A historically true narrative of racial and economic inequality is used and was used for nefarious means. And the fallout in this situation was that there would be mass protest against an administration that was aligned to Oak Bay and the realities of state capture that have set the country many years back. And you might be asking yourself where I'm going with this, but where the antiquated way of spraying press releases as bait for coverage and the spin for narrative control fail, there's an opportunity for us to exploit. And it's a new way, and it's a new way of ethical relevance. For a shift is upon us, and it would be naive of us not to move along with it. And it brings up conversations that we should be having as corporates and as agencies. To the corporate, yes, you can control your narrative, but you cannot control the collective societal narrative. And we need to be asking ourselves these questions. As a corporate, as a corporation, what is your principal standing in a world that is ideologically polarized, a world that is savvy, a world that is hyper-opinionated, a world that has bad actors that are intent on disseminating misinformation? To the agency, and in particular the PR agency, as an intermediary between the client and the audience, yours is not only to optimize the narrative, but also be a critical filter that enables the corporation to navigate the societal temperature across multi-channels in order to be relevant. Above all, and I think relevance is a cousin to interest, and interest can be engineered, because this engineering abides by the age-old creed of story elements. What is the client's vision? Does it readily align with data-driven facts? Because the data feeds the story, and the story feeds the data. When we have these data-driven facts, what is the responsive narrative arc according to these facts? Whether we're taking all of those facts into a campaign, social media campaign, an op-ed, or a media appearance. And how do we measure the effectiveness of the narrative through audience engagement? And lastly, it's critical, have we let go of the idea of being a grandstanding broadcaster of messages to take on an alternative role of being a participant within a community instead? And Mab spoke about this earlier too. That's who we are as agencies, as corporations. We are now part of a community. But that said, the toolbox is only efficient if accompanied by a tone of empathy that is resonant in these times. I mean, we are all famous now. Social media means the most plugged-in humans create stories, share them, and manage them, resulting in interactions that these people that are on social media manage on a daily basis. And full-time creativity is no longer a lucky career choice. It's a global lifestyle. In this instance, the idea of awareness is no longer the preserve of the agency, but it's a game that is played by everyone, from a DJ in a TikTok video to the thought leader with a podcast. All the while, this game feeds the social media machine in real time and is designed to hook us with never-ending strings of flashing emotive cues. And we need to be navigating these cues, and while doing so, asking ourselves a very key question: what matters most to an audience? Yes, we've got shareholders and stakeholders and competitors to be accountable to, but ultimately we are all influencing an audience. And the answer to that question on how does the audience matter is that as communicators, becoming relevant today requires us to be so much more. The communicator of the brand narrative becomes both a conversationalist and an observant psychoanalyst. And like in any relationship that is worth investing in, this relationship beckons us as practitioners to be transparent in dialogue, to understand the nature of in-groups and out-groups relative to the audience as psychoanalysts. And as you may have guessed, at the baseline level, when we are psychoanalysts, one group will consider itself an us, whilst the other may view themselves as a them with regards to opinion and position. So we're operating in a world that is requiring us to be a little bit more, to understand the in-groups, the out-groups, to understand the us and the them. And the incentive for us as communicators is in the ability to dole out and equally manage messages that do not further polarize, but rather that are rather crafted to be nuggets of service and insight. And that, for me, right there, is the sweet spot of where relevance exists in our trade. This time that we are in is requiring a total reconfiguration that takes us from running a racket called spin to being dynamic storytellers, from ho-hum to headline.